The stagecoach rolled into Greystone just as the sun dropped behind the ridge, painting the sky the color of an old bruise, purple fading into gray, gray fading into nothing. The town appeared slowly, the way all hard places do, as if it had grown out of the rock itself rather than been built by human hands. Wooden storefronts, dust-colored and weathered, lined a single main street that ended at nothing in particular. A water trough, a general store with a crooked sign, a church so small it looked like an apology. Wren Calloway pressed her fingers against the cracked leather window flap and looked out at all of it without moving. She had been traveling for 11 days. Her back ached in a way that had become its own kind of silence, steady and unremarkable. Her traveling dress, once a respectable dark green, had absorbed enough dust to look closer to brown. She did not care about the dress. She had stopped caring somewhere around the 3rd day. What she cared about was the letter folded inside her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. She did not need to unfold it to remember the words. Owen Holt had written in a careful, unhurried hand, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who meant what he said and took his time saying it. He had described the land, the way the morning came in, slow over the ridge, the sound the wind made through the dry grass in the evening, like something breathing. He had written, "I am not a man of many words, Miss Calloway, but I mean every one I put to paper. I would like to build something here that lasts. I think you might be the kind of woman who understands what that means." Wren had read that line in her small room above the laundry on a cold morning and felt something shift inside her chest. Not love. She was not the kind of woman who fell in love with letters, but something like recognition. The feeling of reading a map and finally finding the town she had been looking for. The stagecoach lurched to a stop. She gathered her 2 bags, one large, one small, both carrying everything she owned in the world, and stepped down onto the street. The air was different here, thinner, cleaner than the city she had left, which had smelled of coal smoke and river water, and the particular exhaustion of too many people living too close together. She stood in the fading light and looked around for Owen Holt. There were a few people on the street. A woman hanging laundry despite the late hour. 2 men talking near the general store, neither paying attention to the coach. A boy chasing a dog in the direction of the church. And then, leaning against the post at the edge of the boardwalk, a man. He was tall in a way that seemed practical rather than impressive, like a fence post planted deep enough to survive bad weather. His hat was pulled low. His coat was dark and worn at the elbows. He was watching her, not the way men sometimes watched women arriving alone in unfamiliar places, not with that particular calculation that Wren had learned to recognize and step around. He was watching her the way a person watches something they have been dreading. She walked toward him because there was no one else. "Are you Miss Calloway?" His voice was low and even, the kind that did not rise at the end of questions because it had already decided the answer. "I am," she said. "And you're not Owen Holt." Something moved across his face, gone before she could name it. "No," he said. "I'm Jasper, his brother." She waited. The word brother sat between them on the dusty air. She waited for the next sentence, the explanation, the apology, the perfectly reasonable account of why Owen had sent someone else to collect her. Jasper Holt looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "He's been held up," he said. "Out on the north end of the property. He asked me to bring you out to the ranch." The words were flat and correct, nothing in them to argue with. And yet, Wren stood there with 11 days of travel in her bones, and that letter pressed against her ribs, and felt, with the quiet certainty she had learned to trust, that something was wrong. She did not say so. She had learned that too, when to say a thing and when to carry it quietly until she understood it better. "All right," she said. "Thank you for coming." He took her large bag without asking. She kept the small one. They walked to where a wagon waited, a single bay horse standing patient in the traces, and Jasper helped her up onto the bench and said nothing more. She sat beside him in the gathering dark as Greystone fell away behind them and the land opened up around them like a held breath. She watched the country as they rode. It was not beautiful the way she had expected, not soft or green or gentle. It was the kind of landscape that asked something of a person, that required looking at it on its own terms and deciding whether one could live inside that kind of honesty. Long grass, silver in the fading light, rock outcroppings that rose up sudden and unapologetic, the sky enormous overhead, more stars appearing every minute as the light died, more than she had ever seen in her life. The kind of sky that made a person feel very small and, strangely, less afraid of it. They rode in silence for a long time. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of two people, each carrying something heavy and not ready to set it down. They passed the northern corner of the property, just as the last of the light disappeared. Wren looked out across the dark land and saw, at the edge of what she could make out in the moonlight, a stretch of fencing that had come down, posts leaning, rails scattered in the grass, as if something had walked through it long ago and no one had come back to repair the damage. She looked at the fence. Then she looked at Jasper Holt's profile in the dark. He was looking at it too. His jaw was set in a way she recognized, the way a person's jaw sets when they are looking at something they cannot fix and cannot stop looking at anyway. She turned away and said nothing. The ranch house came into view a few minutes later, low and solid, built close to the ground like it was bracing against something. Lamplight in one window. A barn to the left, large enough for several horses. A garden plot along the south wall, still and dry at this time of year. A well with a rope pulley. Practical, honest. The kind of place that did not promise more than it could deliver. Jasper helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag inside. The kitchen was warm. Someone had left a pot on the stove, something with beans and salt pork, filling the room with a smell that was plain and good. The table was scrubbed clean. There was a lamp on it, turned up enough to see by. "Your room's through there," Jasper said, nodding toward a door at the back of the kitchen. "You'll find it's been kept up." "Thank you," she said. He turned to take the horse to the barn, and she stood in the warm kitchen alone for a moment, her small bag in her hand, looking at the room around her. Owen's kitchen, Owen's table, Owen's lamp burning on Owen's table. She pushed open the door and stepped into the back room. It was small and clean. A bed with a quilt folded at the foot, a washstand with a basin and a pitcher, a single window facing east, morning light, which she appreciated without quite knowing why. On the small table beside the bed, there was a stack of letters. Her letters, every one she had written over the past 6 months, still in their envelopes, tied with a piece of twine. She picked up the first one and checked the envelope. Not opened. She checked the second. Also unopened, she went through each one. 6 months of letters. Not one had been read. She set them down on the table very carefully. There was a simple explanation. He had been saving them, meant to read them all at once. Some men were like that. It was a reasonable explanation. She had known women married to men like that. She sat on the edge of the bed and did not take off her coat. Outside she heard the barn door, the sound of Jasper tending the horse, the ordinary sounds of a man ending his day. After a while, she heard his boots on the kitchen floor. Then nothing. She sat there for a long time in the lamplight with her unopened letters on the table beside her, and thought about the fence she had seen in the dark, and about the way Jasper Holt had looked at it. In the morning, she did what she always did when she did not know what else to do. She worked. She found flour and lard and salt in the kitchen cabinet and made biscuits before the light had fully come. She found coffee and put it on. She found eggs and cracked them into a pan with the focused efficiency of a woman who had cooked in circumstances where wasting anything was a kind of failure. By the time Jasper came in from the barn, the kitchen smelled like something worth walking toward. She had cooked in worse kitchens, and for less reason. She had cooked in the cramped back room of the clinic where her father worked in his last years, on a stove that required coaxing and patience, and a particular angle of the damper to function properly. She had cooked in the boarding house room above the laundry, on a hot plate that ran warm on one side and not at all on the other. She had learned that cooking was one of the things that stayed reliable when other things did not, that the chemistry of flour and lard and heat was the same in a good kitchen as a bad one, and the smell of biscuits was the smell of biscuits, regardless of how complicated the rest of the morning was going to be. This kitchen was a good one, well built, well stocked, maintained by a man who had cared about it. She felt that as she moved through it, felt the evidence of Owen Holt in the way the shelves were organized, in the good condition of the pans, in the small, careful repairs that had been made to the cabinet hinges. A man who maintained his kitchen properly was a man who understood that small things added up to something, and that something was worth maintaining. She thought about him as she cooked. She did that sometimes. Thought about the person she had been writing to for 6 months, the person she had never met, constructing an understanding of him from evidence the way she constructed an understanding of most things. From his letters, she had learned that he was careful and honest and not given to exaggeration. From his kitchen, she learned that he was practical and attentive to detail. From what Jasper had told her, she learned that he had been brave in the particular quiet way that required no audience. From what she had found in the tin box, she learned that he had been willing to spend his last good months on something larger than himself. It was a strange kind of knowing. It was incomplete, but it was real. And she had learned not to discount real things simply because they were not the shape she had expected them to be. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table, set with 2 plates, 2 cups, a plate of biscuits still steaming, and then looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not irritation, not gratitude, something more careful than either. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He ate with the focused quiet of a man used to eating alone. She watched him the way she had learned to watch people, not staring, not obvious, just that particular quality of attention that let her see what they were not saying. What Jasper Holt was not saying was considerable. After a while, she refilled his coffee without asking. He looked up. Their eyes met for a moment. the first real time since the stagecoach. And she saw something there that made her set the coffee pot down more carefully than she needed to. It was the look of a man about to say something true, who could not yet find the words. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her hands were still. Her face did not change. She had sat at enough bedsides to know when something irrevocable was about to enter the room, and she had learned that the best thing was to hold still and let it come. "I tried to write to you," Jasper said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow, deliberate movement, like a man choosing how to carry a weight. Twice, the first letter came back, the hospital where Owen had your address. It had closed by the time I wrote. I didn't know that. The second letter went to your boarding house, but you had already left. She knew then. She had known since the fence, since the unopened letters, since the way he had looked at everything except her face, when he said his brother was held up on the north end of the property. She had known and carried it through the night and into this morning, and now it was here in the room with them. "Owen is gone," she said. Not a question. Jasper set down the coffee cup. "Yes." His voice did not waver. She understood that it cost him something to keep it steady. 3 months ago, his heart. It was fast. He didn't suffer. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something ordinary in the eaves. The fire in the stove made its small, constant sound. Wren looked at her hands flat on the table. The hands her father had trained to be precise, to be steady, to find the thing that was wrong and address it without flinching. She had used these hands in rooms where people were dying and rooms where people were surviving, and she had learned that both required the same thing from her. Presence, just the willingness to stay in the room. "I'm sorry," Jasper said, and she could hear that he meant it in more ways than he was naming. "How long?" she said. "Have you been trying to figure out how to tell me?" "Since the moment I saw you step off that coach." She nodded slowly. She looked up at him. His face in the morning light was harder to read than she expected. Not closed. Closed was something she recognized. A door deliberately shut. This was different. This was a man who had taken every feeling he had and put it somewhere below the surface, and then forgotten which rope to pull to bring it back up. She thought about the letters on the table in the bedroom, about a man who had written them, sealed them, addressed them, who had planned a whole life and described it to her in careful handwriting over 6 months, and had not lived long enough to read a single word she wrote back. "He didn't open my letters," she said. "No." Jasper looked at the table. He kept them. He was saving them. He said reading them would feel like cheating, like getting a preview of you, when he wanted to know you in person first. Something moved through her that she did not try to name. She stood up. She went to the stove and poured herself more coffee she did not need. She stood with her back to him for a moment, not because she was breaking down, because she was not, because she had learned long ago that breaking down came at the cost of the people around her, but because she needed one moment that was only hers. Then she turned around. "I have nowhere to go back to," she said. She said it the way she said most true things, plainly, without asking for anything in return. "The hospital is closed. The room above the laundry is someone else's by now. I came here because I had run out of other options, and I am not too proud to say that out loud." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you for anything except time to figure out what comes next." I can work. I'll earn my place here until I've done that." Jasper Holt said nothing for a while. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Not the way a man stalls for time, but the way a man works through something that needs working through. She held still and let him do it. "Owen told me about you," he said finally. "What did he say?" "That you were the kind of woman who didn't complain about what couldn't be helped." He picked up his coffee cup again. He was right. She sat back down. They finished their coffee. Outside, the morning had come in full over the ridge, the slow, unhurried way Owen had described it in his first letter. And the light came through the east window and fell across the table between them, and neither of them said anything more for a while. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. And that was something. Later that morning, while Jasper was out checking the stock, Wren found her way to the small room off the kitchen that served as Owen's office. She was not looking for anything in particular. She told herself she was simply orienting herself, learning the shape of the place, but she was also in the quiet and practical part of herself that never fully went off duty, paying attention. The desk was modest, a ledger, a tin box for correspondence, a pen and inkwell. She did not open the tin box. She did open the ledger, because that was the kind of thing you looked at when you needed to understand the bones of a situation. Numbers did not lie in the way that people sometimes did, not out of malice, but out of the very human need to make things sound more manageable than they were. She turned the pages slowly. The ranch's accounts were kept in a neat hand. Owen's, she assumed. Income from cattle sales, payments for supplies and wages, regular and unsurprising for the most part, the ordinary arithmetic of a working ranch. And then, toward the back, a page that was different, a single large payment recorded 3 months before Owen's death. And beside it, in the margin, in handwriting slightly different from Owen's, smaller, more compressed, as if written in a hurry or to be hard to read, a single letter and a name that had been partially scratched out. She could make out the first letter clearly, M, and beneath it, the beginning of another name, CR, before the ink had been dragged sideways, obscuring the rest. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she closed the ledger carefully and put it back exactly where she had found it. She was still standing at the desk when she heard boots on the porch. Through the window, she could see a man approaching the house on horseback, not Jasper. This man sat his horse the way certain men do when they own things, leaning back slightly, like the world was arranged for his comfort. He dismounted at the gate, perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had learned to be pleasant, not as a natural expression, but as a tool, something picked up and put down as needed. Jasper came around the corner of the barn. She watched through the window as the two men spoke. She could read the set of Jasper's shoulders, how they went still and careful, the way a man's shoulders go when he is choosing not to react to something that deserves a reaction. The visitor smiled at something Jasper said. It was a smile that started at the mouth and did not travel further. Then he got back on his horse and rode away toward town, unhurried, the way men ride when they believe the outcome is already settled. Jasper came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "That was Cade Merritt," he said. "Who is he?" "He owns most of the land around here, or he's working on it." Jasper set his hat on the hook by the door. Owen had a debt, a lending arrangement, nothing unusual. Merritt bought that debt a week after Owen died. He came to discuss repayment terms. She turned her cup slowly in her hands. How much time do you have? 6 weeks. She nodded. She did not ask whether the number was manageable. She could see from the way he said it that it was not. And if you can't meet it? He wants the north parcel. Jasper looked out the window toward where the broken fence sat invisible in the daylight, its damage patient and waiting. That's always been what he wanted. Wren looked at him, at the careful way he held himself, at the hands he had pressed flat against the counter behind him, as if he needed something solid to press against. Owen knew this was coming, she said. Something shifted in Jasper's face, not quite pain. The shape of something that had been living under the surface for a long time. I think, he said slowly, Owen knew more than he told me, about a lot of things. That evening, she sat at the small desk in the bedroom, where Owen's letters lay unopened on the table. She did not reach for them. She reached instead into the bottom of her small bag and found the flat wooden case at the bottom. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, lay her father's surgical instruments. 6 pieces, each fitted into its own groove, each maintained to a standard that had nothing to do with the fact that he had been dead for 4 years, and she had no hospital to use them in anymore. She looked at them the way she looked at them every night, not out of sentimentality, but out of the same need that made her make biscuits in the morning and read ledgers in the afternoon. The need to know what she had, what she was working with. She closed the case and pressed her palm flat against the lid for a moment. Outside in the kitchen, she could hear Jasper moving. Small sounds, a chair, a drawer. The quiet industry of a solitary man at the end of his day. She wondered if he had eaten. She wondered what 6 weeks looked like from where he was standing. She stood up and went to knock on the kitchen door frame. He was at the table with a piece of paper in front of him, a pen in his hand, and the expression of a man who had been sitting that way for a while without writing anything. "Have you eaten?" she asked. He looked up. Some of the careful composure had come loose at the edges. Not much, but enough to see. Not yet. "There's still beans on the stove," she said. She heated them. She put bread on the table. She sat across from him and did not look at the paper with nothing written on it, and he did not explain it. And they ate in the same difficult silence they had been sharing all day. But this time, it felt slightly different. Less like 2 strangers in the same place. More like 2 people beginning, very slowly and without any particular plan, to occupy the same difficulty. After a while, without looking up from his bowl, Jasper said, "I read his letters, the ones he wrote to you, but never sent." She went still. "I shouldn't have," he said, "but I needed to understand. I don't know what I needed. I'm sorry." She considered that. She considered him. Then, what did he say? Jasper set down his spoon. He looked at her across the table with the first fully open look he had given her since she stepped off the stagecoach, and what she saw there was grief, yes, but also something else. Something that had been waiting for somewhere to land. "He said," Jasper told her quietly, "that if something happened to him, I would take care of you. He said I wouldn't know I was going to, but I would." A pause. He said it like he already knew. The kitchen held the particular quiet that follows something true being said. Not empty, but full, the way a room is full after something has shifted inside it. Outside, the high plains wind moved through the grass. That sound Owen had described, like something breathing. The sound he had never gotten to show her himself. She looked at Jasper Holt, at the weight he was carrying that had no name yet, only the shape of it pressing against everything he tried to say and everything he tried not to say. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He nodded, cleared his bowl, and said good night in a voice that was quieter than it had been all day. She sat alone at the table after he was gone. She pressed her hand flat against the worn wood, testing the substance of things, making sure they were real. The lamp threw soft light across Owen Holt's kitchen, the kitchen of a man she had never met, who had thought of her carefully and kindly across 6 months of letters and had not lived long enough to sit where she was sitting. She stayed there a while longer. Then she went to bed. And somewhere on the road between town and the ranch, in the cool dark of the High Plains night, Cade Merritt rode home at an easy pace, satisfied, as men like that often are, that everything was going according to plan. 3 days passed in the way that hard days sometimes do, not slowly, not quickly, but with a particular density, each hour carrying more weight than it looked like it should. Wren learned the shape of the ranch the way she learned most things, by moving through it quietly and paying attention. She learned that Jasper was up before dawn every morning without exception, that he took his coffee black and his breakfast standing at the counter when he thought no one would notice, and that he checked the north fence line every evening at dusk even though there was nothing there to check. The fence was down, had been down for a long time, and looking at it accomplished nothing except the particular kind of punishment that certain men inflict on themselves with great consistency and no apparent intention of stopping. She learned that the ranch had once run more cattle than it did now. She could tell by the size of the barn, by the number of empty stalls, by the way the grazing land stretched further than the current herd required. Something had contracted here. Something had pulled back from what it used to be, and the land still held the memory of the larger thing it had once contained. She learned that Jasper Holt was not a man who asked for help. Not because he was proud in the small, brittle way that some men are proud, but because asking for help required believing that help was available, and she was not sure he believed that anymore. On the 4th morning, she found the ledger again. She had thought about it every day since she had first seen it. The scratched-out notation in the margin, the letter M, the partial name beneath it. She had thought about it the way she thought about symptoms that didn't add up, the kind of detail that sat at the edge of a diagnosis and would not leave. She opened the ledger to the page she remembered and looked at it again in better light, and what she saw confirmed what she had suspected. The scratch-out had not been done by Owen. The pen pressure was different. Someone else had tried to obscure that entry after Owen had written it. She was still standing at the desk with the ledger open when Jasper came in from the south pasture earlier than she expected. He stopped in the doorway of the small office and looked at her. She did not close the ledger or pretend she had been doing something else. She turned it so he could see the page and pointed to the entry without saying anything. He crossed the room and looked at it. She watched his face while he did. She had learned to read faces in rooms where the truth was often too difficult for people to say plainly, and what she read in Jasper's face was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who had already suspected something and was now being shown the shape of it made visible. "Owen made that entry," she said. "Someone else crossed out part of it." "I know." His voice was quiet. "You've seen this before. I saw it the week after he died, when I went through his papers." He straightened up. I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't. She looked at him. What do you think it means? He set his hands on the desk and looked at the ledger instead of her. What she read in that, the angle of his shoulders, the particular stillness, told her it was not reluctance, but the careful gathering of something he had been holding at a distance for a long time. Then, Owen was looking into something. In the months before he died, he was asking questions around town that he didn't explain to me, about land transfers, about men who had died in the past few years, men with property, men whose deaths had seemed straightforward. He paused. I thought he was just being careful, watching out for himself. He had a way of noticing things before other people did. What kind of men? Wren asked. The ones who died. Ranchers, all younger than they should have been to go the way they went. All with land that ended up in Cade Merritt's holdings inside a year. He said it flatly, without drama, the way a man states a fact he has been living with long enough that the horror of it has gone somewhere quiet and cold. 4 men in 3 years, all said to be heart trouble. The room was very still. Wren looked down at the ledger. She thought about what she knew, which was what her father had taught her, which was how to look at a body and understand what it was saying. She thought about 4 men, each one young enough that heart trouble should have raised questions, and apparently had not. She thought about Dr. Aldous Crane, whose name she had heard mentioned twice already in Greystone. Once as the man who had tended Owen in his final days, once in a passing remark by the woman at the general store, who had said, with the particular admiration that small towns reserve for their few educated residents, that the doctor had been such a comfort to so many families. Who confirmed the cause of death? She said. For the 4 men. Jasper looked at her. Crane. She closed the ledger. She set it back on the desk exactly as she had found it. She was careful about that, about leaving things where they belonged, undisturbed, so that whatever she was beginning to understand could be understood quietly, without alerting anyone to the fact that she was understanding it. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer me honestly. All right. Owen's death. Crane confirmed it as heart failure. Yes. Was there anything about it that seemed inconsistent? Jasper was quiet for a long time, long enough that she knew the answer before he gave it. He was 41, he said finally. He was strong. He worked hard. He had no history of anything wrong with his heart. He looked at the window. But Crane was certain, and Owen was gone, and I didn't have a reason to push back. You didn't have a reason to push back, she said. Not a judgment, just the shape of it. No. The word came out stripped of everything except what it was. She nodded. She was already thinking about Cutter. She had heard the name from the woman who ran the boarding house in town, Mrs. Aldgate, a narrow, watchful woman who had offered Wren a cup of tea with the transparent intention of extracting information and had ended up giving considerably more than she received. Mrs. Aldgate had mentioned Cutter in passing, describing him as that strange old man who used to mix medicines before he took to drink, and had said it with the particular dismissiveness that people use for those they have decided not to take seriously. But Wren had learned that the people a town decided not to take seriously were often the people worth talking to. The following morning, she told Jasper she was going into town for supplies. He offered to take her. She told him she preferred to walk. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts skepticism and the beginning of something that was not quite respect yet, but was leaning in that direction. He did not argue. He told her the road into town was straight and she couldn't lose it. And he told her that if she spoke to anyone at the general store, she should give her name as Wren Holt. And then he seemed to realize what he had said and looked briefly as though he regretted it. She did not say anything about it. She put on her coat and walked to town. The road was straight, as advertised, and the morning was cold and clear, the sky a hard, bright blue that felt like something earned. She walked quickly, the way she had always walked, as if she had a destination and intended to reach it. She found Cutter's place at the edge of town, past the livery, in a small building that had once been a proper apothecary, and now looked as though it had simply given up on that ambition while retaining the basic habit of existing. The sign above the door was faded to illegibility. She knocked anyway. The man who answered was perhaps 65, with the eyes of someone who had been sharp once, and was still sharp underneath several layers of something applied to dull the edge. He looked at her the way people look at unexpected visitors, not with hostility exactly, but with the caution of someone who had learned that unexpected things were usually unwelcome. "My name is Wren Calloway," she said. "I'm at the Holt Ranch. I understand you knew Owen Holt." Something moved in his eyes. He stepped back from the door, not in welcome exactly, but in the way a man opens a door when he has been expecting a particular conversation and cannot decide whether he is relieved or afraid that it has finally arrived. Inside, the building smelled of old wood and something herbal, the ghost of what it used to be, still haunting the walls. He sat her down at a table that held a half-empty bottle and 2 cups he did not offer to fill. He sat across from her and looked at his hands. "Owen came to see me," Cutter said. 4, maybe 5 months before he died. He brought me something to look at. She waited. "A sample." He said it carefully, the way a man says a word he has been keeping in a very particular place. "From a water source on the Aldermack property. That was one of the men who died, Edwin Aldermack, 2 years back. Owen had gotten access to it somehow. He wanted me to look at it because he said he didn't trust anyone else in town to tell him the truth." "What did you find?" she asked. Cutter was quiet for a moment. He turned the bottle on the table without pouring from it. A habit, she thought. The motion of a hand that needed something to do. "There was something in it," he said, "something not naturally occurring. A compound from a plant, not a manufactured thing, but concentrated in a way that doesn't happen without intention." He looked up at her. "In small enough amounts, over time, it affects the heart, builds up slowly. By the time a man feels sick, it's been working on him for weeks or months. And when his heart finally gives out, there's nothing visible to indicate it wasn't natural, unless you know what to look for." The room was very still. Outside, someone was crossing the street. Ordinary footsteps on the boards, the sounds of a town going about its day with no idea what was being said inside this small, forgotten building. "Did Owen know what this meant?" she asked. He knew what it could mean. He was careful about saying it out loud. He was a careful man. Cutter set the bottle down. "He asked me to test the water source on his own property too. I did. His was clean." He paused. "So whatever was happening, it wasn't happening to him the same way. His death, that was real. His heart was genuinely weak. He had known for a while, I think. He just didn't tell anyone." She thought about the letters. about a man who had spent 6 months writing to a woman about morning light and dry grass and the kind of life he wanted to build, knowing all the while that his heart might not hold long enough to build it, writing anyway, sending for her anyway. And in his last weeks, investigating what was being done to his neighbors, even as he arranged for the woman he had never met to have somewhere to go. She held still for a moment, her breath even. "The sample," she said, "and the results. Do you still have them?" Cutter reached inside his coat and produced a small folded cloth. He set it on the table between them. It was a piece of plain cotton, and on it, in the same compressed, pressured handwriting she had seen in the margin of Owen's ledger, were 4 lines of notation. Results. His results. Written down and kept hidden in the lining of his coat. "I kept a copy," he said. Owen kept the original. "I don't know what happened to his copy after he died." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this because he trusted you. He used to talk about you. Said he'd never met a woman who wrote letters the way you did. Like she was actually thinking about what she wanted to say instead of just filling up the page." He paused. "He said you were the kind of person who didn't look away from things." She picked up the cloth and folded it carefully and put it inside her coat, against her ribs, next to the place where Owen's letter used to live. She stood up. "Thank you," she said. "Be careful," Cutter said. "Crane has been in this town a long time, and Merritt has been buying land for longer than that. They're not going to stop because someone starts asking questions." "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it, Owen picked a good person to trust with this. She walked back to the ranch the long way, along the edge of the grazing land where the grass ran silver in the wind. She needed the time. She needed to let what she knew settle into the shape it was going to take. Because information was not the same as understanding, and understanding was not the same as knowing what to do with it. Each one required its own kind of patience. She thought about her father as she walked, about the particular quality of his frustration in the years when he was being ignored and discredited, not angry, never quite angry in the explosive way, but carrying something heavier than anger, which was the frustration of a person who can see clearly and cannot make other people see what they see. She had watched that frustration compress him slowly over those last years, and she had understood even then that it was not the dismissal that hurt him most. It was the knowledge that while people were dismissing him, other people were dying. He had been right, and now she had the proof of it in her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs alongside the cloth from Cutter and the letter from Owen that she still carried out of habit, and something more than habit. 3 things against her ribs. 3 pieces of the same truth, arrived at from different directions by different people at different times. She breathed in through her nose and out slowly, the way her father had taught her to breathe before a difficult procedure, not to calm herself, but to arrive fully in the present moment, which was the only place anything useful could be done. She was almost back to the ranch when she saw a buggy parked outside, not Cade Merritt's horse, but a neat, closed buggy she did not recognize. Coming around the side of the house, speaking with Jasper in the yard, was a man in a dark coat with the upright, deliberate bearing of someone who expected to be listened to. Perhaps 60, silver-haired, with a face that had mastered the art of looking reasonable. She recognized the type before she knew the man. The type that smiled with eyes precisely calibrated, not too warm, not too cold, exactly the temperature that made people feel they were being looked after. She walked to the gate and let herself in, and both men turned. Jasper's face, in that moment, told her everything she needed to know about how the conversation had been going. "Wren," he said, "this is Dr. Crane." The doctor turned his smile on her with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I've been meaning to come by, paying my respects and checking in on Jasper. It's been a difficult season for this household." "It has," she said. She shook his hand. His grip was dry and measured. She noted the ink stain on his right index finger, recent, not yet faded, and the way his eyes moved to her coat pocket for just a fraction of a second before returning to her face. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people would not notice. She noticed. "I understand you come from the East," Crane said pleasantly. "Nursing, was it?" "I worked in a medical facility, yes," she said, matching his pleasantness in kind. "My father was a physician. He trained me." "Wonderful." The smile did not waver. "We don't get many with formal training out this way. I'm sure you'll find things here rather more rudimentary." "I'm adaptable," she said. He stayed another few minutes, speaking mostly to Jasper about the ranch, about the season, about nothing that required particular attention. Then he climbed back into his buggy and drove away toward town at the same unhurried pace as Merritt, that pace belonging to men who believed the outcome was already settled. Jasper waited until the buggy was out of sight. "How was town?" "Informative," she said. "Is there somewhere we can talk? Inside, away from the windows?" He nodded once and led her into the house. She told him what Cutter had told her. She set the folded cloth on the kitchen table and smoothed it open so he could read the notation. She laid it out the way her father had taught her to lay out a diagnosis. Clearly, precisely, in the order that made the logic visible. When she finished, Jasper was very still. He was looking at the cloth, but she did not think he was reading it anymore. She thought he was somewhere else, in a room 3 months back, standing beside his brother's body and believing what he had been told because he had no reason not to believe it, and because grief takes a person's capacity for skepticism and puts it somewhere they can't reach for a while. "4 men," he said finally, not a question. "4 that Cutter knows of. There may be more. And Owen found this. Owen found the beginning of it. He didn't live long enough to take it further." She paused. "But he left the pieces. Cutter has the analysis. Owen kept a record in the ledger. And whatever M. meant, Merritt Crane." Jasper said it without inflection, like a man reading 2 names off a list he had been building without knowing it. He pressed both palms flat on the table. The same gesture she made, she realized, the same instinct for solid ground. "Crane has been the only doctor in Greystone for 12 years. He signed every death certificate for every person who died here in that time." "Yes." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. She let it sit. She did not move to fill it. Then Cade Merritt's buggy came up the road for the second time that week. Jasper saw it through the window before she did. She saw his shoulders change, that careful stillness coming over him, the stillness of a man who has decided not to react because he is not yet ready to show what reacting would look like. Merritt dismounted at the gate with the easy confidence of a man arriving at a property he already considered his. He came to the door and knocked with 3 precise knocks, and Jasper opened it, and Merritt looked past him to where Wren was standing at the kitchen table, the folded cloth already moved to her coat pocket. "Jasper," Merritt said, "hope I'm not intruding." His eyes moved to Wren. "Mrs. Holt," Settling in, I hope. Very comfortably, she said. He came inside without quite being invited. He took a chair at the table without quite being offered one. He was a man who had long ago stopped waiting for permissions. He set a folded document on the table between them and pressed it flat with 2 fingers. I wanted to bring this myself, he said, rather than send someone, out of respect for Owen. He said Owen's name the way certain people say the names of the dead, with a practiced solemnity that is meant to signal feeling and mostly signals its absence. This is an updated accounting of the debt with the terms I'm prepared to offer. 6 weeks, as discussed, or... He paused. He smiled the smile that didn't travel past its starting point. There is an alternative I'd like you to consider. Jasper did not sit. He stood at the counter with his arms at his sides. I'm listening. The north parcel. You sign it over. I cancel the debt in full, and you keep everything south of the ridge line. Clean arrangement. No lawyers, no courts, no difficulty. Merritt spread his hands, a gesture of generosity, practiced and precise. I'm trying to make this easy for you, Jasper. I've always respected this ranch. I respected Owen. This is the simplest path forward. Jasper's jaw set. She could see the thing moving underneath his stillness. Not quite anger and not quite grief, but made of both those things and something harder beneath them. He let Merritt wait. I'll think about it, Jasper said. Merritt's smile held perfectly. Of course, take your time. He stood and set the document on the edge of the table. I'll leave this with you. He looked at Wren. It was a pleasure, Mrs. Holt. And you, she said. She watched him ride away with the same quality of careful, complete attention her father had spent years teaching her. She noted how Merritt had looked at the kitchen table when he came in, specifically at the place where the cloth had been. She noted how he had angled his body so that his view of the room was maximized. She noted that he had not once looked at the document he claimed to be leaving in good faith. When she turned from the window, Jasper was looking at her. He knew you'd been through the ledger, she said. How? He looked at the desk when he came in. The door was slightly open. He checked without appearing to check. She paused. And Crane was here this morning. I think Crane told him I came from a medical background. Jasper's jaw tightened. They're moving faster, she said. Both of them, today. That's not coincidence. Something shifted. Either they know more than we thought, or they're worried that we do. What do we do? That question landed differently than the others. She heard the genuine, unguarded weight of it. The first time he had asked her something without already knowing the answer he intended to give. She understood that it cost him something. Asking for help from a woman he had known for 4 days was not a small thing for a man like Jasper Holt, and she did not make it smaller by treating it lightly. We protect what we have, she said. The cloth, the ledger entry, whatever else Owen left. And we find out what MCOR means, all of it, before the 6 weeks are up. He held her gaze. She had noticed over the past days that Jasper Holt had 2 kinds of silence, the kind that was a wall and the kind that was a door. This was the second kind. Cutter, he said. Did he say if Owen told him anything else? Anything about where the rest of the information might be? He said Owen kept records, separate from the ledger. She paused. He didn't know where. Something crossed his face. He looked at the window, not at the fence he couldn't see in the dark, but in its direction, the way a person looks at a thing they are not yet ready to look at directly. Then he said, so quietly she almost missed it. Owen had a place, out by the north fence, a gap in the rock outcropping on the far end. He used to keep things there when we were boys, things he didn't want found. He looked at the window, at the direction of the broken fence, invisible in the middle distance. I never looked. After he died, I never... He stopped. She understood. There were places grief made inaccessible, places too close to the center of the thing. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "before anyone comes." He nodded. He reached out and picked up Merritt's document from the edge of the table and looked at it for a moment. He set it back down without reading it. "He was right about one thing," he said. He was still looking at the document. "Who?" "Owen, in the letter." He did not elaborate. She did not ask him to. Outside, the high plains dark had settled in full around the ranch, and the fire in the stove made its small sound, and somewhere past the edge of what they could see, the broken fence stood patient in the night, waiting for the morning to show them what was hidden in the rock beside it. That night, she lay in the narrow bed in Owen's room with her father's instrument case under her hand and thought about 4 men, and a compound in a water source, and a doctor who had been in Greystone for 12 years, and a letter with a partial name that someone had tried to scratch out. She thought about Owen Holt, who had known his heart was failing and had spent his last months not making his peace with it, but using what time he had left to build something that would outlast him. Evidence, connection, a woman with steady hands coming west on a stagecoach. She pressed her palm against the instrument case. She breathed. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she had never once in her life been afraid of work. What she was afraid of, the thing she lay in the dark turning over carefully, like a piece of evidence she was not sure how to classify, was simpler and more complicated than any of the rest of it. It was the look on Jasper Holt's face when he had said Owen was right about one thing, the way he had not finished the sentence, the space where the rest of the words should have been, and the particular quality of the silence that lived inside it. She was not a woman who had ever let herself be afraid of a silence, but this one was the kind that had a door in it. She fell asleep eventually, the way she always did, not into rest, but into a deeper form of attention, the kind that kept one ear open even in the dark. By morning, she was ready. They went out before the light was full. Jasper had the lantern low, the flame turned down to almost nothing, enough to see by, but not enough to be seen. The morning was cold in the way that high country mornings are cold, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, the air arriving sharp and complete against the face and hands. Wren pulled her coat tighter and followed him through the gray pre-dawn across the property, through the dry grass that whispered against their boots, past the dark shape of the barn, and out toward the northern boundary where the broken fence waited. She had seen it twice in daylight and once in the dark, and each time it looked the same, patient and ruined, the posts leaning at the angles that things lean when they have been left alone for a long time, the rails down in the grass, the gap in the line of it wide enough to walk through without effort. It was the kind of damage that did not happen overnight. It was the kind of damage that accumulated. Jasper stopped at the fence line and stood for a moment with the lantern at his side. He was looking at the ground rather than the fence itself, orienting himself by some internal map she did not have access to. Then he turned east, following the line of the downed rails toward where the land began to rise, and she followed him without speaking. The rock outcropping came into view as the sky lightened. A low ridge of pale stone pushing up through the grass, ancient and indifferent. The kind of geological feature that reminded a person how briefly human things lasted in comparison. It ran perhaps 30 yards along the edge of the property. Jasper moved along it with the careful attention of a man retracing a path he had not walked in a long time, but had never stopped knowing. He stopped at a place where two large slabs of rock angled against each other, creating a gap perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, invisible from more than a few yards away, the kind of place that a boy would find and a man would remember. He crouched down and reached inside. His hand came out with a flat tin box, dented, weathered, the lid rusted at one corner but still sealed. He held it for a moment without opening it, and she stood beside him in the growing light and did not rush him. She understood that some moments required their own time, regardless of urgency. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, were papers. Several folded sheets in Owen's careful hand, a smaller piece of folded paper that appeared older and more worn, and beneath both, something wrapped separately in a piece of dark cloth. Small, dense, about the size of a man's palm. Jasper took everything out carefully and handed the papers to Wren. She unfolded the top sheet. It was written in Owen's hand, dated by season rather than by year, simply late autumn, before the cold set in properly. And it was a record. Names, dates, observations. The 4 men Cutter had mentioned, and 2 more she had not heard of, and beside each name a note about their land, their water source, the timeline from first apparent illness to death. Owen had been thorough. Owen had been, she was beginning to understand, the kind of man who did quietly and carefully what needed doing and did not require an audience for it. She read while Jasper unwrapped the cloth package. Inside was a small glass vial, sealed with wax, containing perhaps 2 teaspoons of dark liquid. He held it up to the growing light. She finished reading and looked at what he was holding. "That's a sample," she said. He kept a sample. He kept everything. Jasper's voice was low and not entirely steady. He was looking at the vial the way a person looks at a thing that proves a theory they had hoped was wrong. He knew. He had known for months before he died that something was being done to these men. And he didn't tell me. She read what was in his voice, not just the anger or the grief, but the thing underneath both of them. The look of a man confronting the fact that the person he trusted most had decided to carry something alone. "He was protecting you," she said. "I didn't need protection." The words came out flat and final, and then, a moment later, in a different voice entirely, "I needed him to tell me." She did not argue with that. She understood it. She had felt the same thing standing in her father's small office after he died, reading the notes in the margins of his books. All the things he had known and worried about and chosen to carry without telling her. The love in that kind of silence was real, and it did not make the silence any less painful. She refolded Owen's papers and put them back in the tin with the vial and the older folded sheet she had not yet read. She looked at Jasper still crouched beside the rock, his hands loose between his knees, the empty oilcloth on the ground in front of him. "He left it here," she said, "for someone to find. He knew someone would come looking." He turned the tin box over in his hands once, slow and deliberate. "He knew I'd come eventually. He knew I couldn't stay away from this fence forever." Something moved across his face. He was counting on me to be exactly as stubborn as I am. It was the first thing approaching a wry observation he had made in her presence, and it surprised her enough that she almost smiled. Almost. She helped him to his feet, not because he needed it, but because the moment seemed to require some small physical acknowledgement of what they had just found and what it meant. He let her, which surprised her too. He was not a man who accepted help easily. The fact that he accepted it now told her something. They walked back to the ranch in the early light with the tin box under Jasper's arm, and the morning came in over the ridge the way Owen had described in his letters. Slow and unhurried, as though it had nowhere else to be. The older folded paper turned out to be a receipt. They read it together at the kitchen table after the sun was fully up, spread flat between their 2 coffee cups. It was a receipt for a transaction. Something purchased from a supplier 2 days' ride from Greystone, the kind of transaction that would mean nothing to someone who did not know what they were looking at. But Wren looked at the item listed and felt the cold logic of it arrive in her chest like a key turning in a lock. It was a plant-based compound, listed under its common name, something she recognized from her father's botanical references, a name that meant nothing to most people and everything to someone who knew what a sustained small dose of it did to a human heart over the course of months. It had been purchased in a quantity too large for any legitimate medical use in a town the size of Greystone, and it had been purchased under a name that began with the same 2 letters Owen had written in the ledger before someone had tried to scratch them out. She sat back and looked at the receipt without speaking for a moment. Then she told Jasper what the compound was. She described what it did in simple, accurate language. Not clinical, not graphic, just precise. She told him how it would appear to a physician looking for heart failure without knowing to look for anything else. She told him that her father had written about it, had documented its misuse, had argued in correspondence with colleagues that it was untraceable under standard examination but detectable with specific testing. Jasper listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "Your father knew how to detect it," he said. "Yes," she paused, "and he taught me." Jasper looked at her. The look was long and careful, and she could see him reassembling something in his understanding, repositioning her in the picture he had been building of who she was and why she was here, and what the combination of her presence and what Owen had left in that rock outcropping might mean. "The sample in the vial," he said. "I can work with it." She set both palms on the edge of the table and looked at him directly. "I can't give you formal documentation, but I can tell you with certainty whether what's in that vial matches what's on that receipt, and that gives us something to take to someone with the authority to act on it." "Who?" he said. "Crane is the only medical authority in Greystone, and every legal instrument in this county has Merritt's fingerprints on it somewhere." "Not everyone," she said. Owen was building toward something. He had Cutter's analysis. He had this receipt. He had records of 6 deaths and the pattern behind them. He was gathering it all for a reason. He was going to take it somewhere, to someone. He just didn't live long enough to do it. She looked at Jasper steadily. "We have to finish what he started." The silence that followed was not a wall and not a door. It was something else, the silence of a decision being made in the quiet interior of a person who does not make decisions lightly. Then Reuben arrived. He came to the back door rather than the front, which was unusual enough to be a signal in itself. Reuben had worked the ranch for 6 years, first under Owen and then under Jasper. A man somewhere in his late 40s with a permanent squint from years in the sun and a quality of deliberate movement that could be read as either slowness or carefulness, depending on how one chose to interpret it. Wren had seen him 3 times in the past days. At the barn, at the edge of the south pasture, once passing the kitchen window without looking in. Each time she had noted him without appearing to note him. He knocked twice, then stood back from the door. Jasper opened it. Reuben looked at Jasper first, then at Wren, then back at Jasper. He held his hat in his hands, turning it at the brim the way people turn things when they are holding on to something difficult. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I should have told you before now. I'm telling you now." Jasper stepped back and let him inside. Reuben sat at the kitchen table and looked at the hat in his hands for a moment before he looked up. He spoke evenly, without self-pity, with the straightforward quality of a man who had decided that the only way through a thing was directly. He had been approached by Cade Merritt 6 weeks before Owen died, he said. Merritt had offered him money. Not a large amount, the amount a man is offered when the person offering knows he is not worth worrying about, to report on the movements at the ranch, what Owen was doing, who he spoke to, when he came and went. Reuben had taken the money. He had sent 3 reports. The 3rd report had described Owen riding out toward the eastern quarter 2 days before Owen collapsed. Merritt had seemed particularly interested in that. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Jasper's face had not changed during the telling, and Wren had watched it carefully, looking for what was underneath. What she saw was controlled, not cold, not theatrical, just a man keeping the lid on something that required a lid. She had seen that quality in physicians who received terrible news in front of patients who needed them to remain steady. She recognized it as a form of love, the discipline of not making one's own reaction the center of the room. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jasper said. Reuben looked at his hat. "Because Merritt sent word yesterday. He wants me to tell him whether Miss Calloway has been anywhere near the north end of the property." A pause. "I'm not going to do that." Something shifted in the line of his shoulders. Then, "What changed?" Reuben looked up. "Owen was good to me. He was good to me for 6 years, and I sold information about him to the man who—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I didn't know then what I know now. What I've put together since. I know now." He set his hat on the table. "Tell me what you need me to do." Wren looked at Reuben and thought about the geography of guilt, how it shifted a person's center of gravity, how it changed the angle from which they held themselves. She thought about how much of the story she had been assembling was made up of people who knew partial things and were afraid to bring their partial things into the same room. Cutter with his hidden analysis, Owen with his tin box in the rock, Reuben with his conscience catching up to him at last. She thought about her father, who had spent the final years of his life trying to get partial things into the same room and being dismissed at every turn. She thought about what it would have meant to him to be in a kitchen like this one, with people like these, with the pieces finally moving toward each other. She picked up the tin box and set it in the center of the table. She spread Owen's papers. She put the receipt beside them and the small cloth from Cutter beside that. She told Reuben what it all was and what it meant, plainly, the way she had told Jasper that morning. She watched his face as he understood it. She watched the guilt in him shift into something else. Not absolution, nothing as easy as that, but the particular focus of a man who has found a specific thing he can do to address a specific wrong. That night, When Reuben had gone back to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Wren took the vial from the tin box and her father's instrument case from the bedroom and set them side by side on the kitchen table. She lit the lamp fully. She opened the case and looked at the 6 instruments in their worn velvet for a moment before she reached for them. She had not used them in almost a year. The last time had been in a situation she did not care to revisit. A cold room, a person who needed help that the official channels had refused to provide, her own hands steady because she had decided they would be steady, and because the person in front of her needed steadiness more than she needed her hands to shake. That was the night she had lost her position. That was the night everything that came afterward had begun. She thought, not for the first time, about the strange arithmetic of consequences. How a single decision could send a life in an entirely different direction, and how the new direction was impossible to evaluate from the vantage point of the decision itself, and how most of the things she valued most about the person she had become were things she had become because of what she had lost. She did not think she would trade the losses, given the choice. But she was not sure. That was wisdom. It might simply be the only way a person could live inside the choices they had already made. She picked up the first instrument and began to work. She worked with the focused, unhurried precision of someone who had been taught that the purpose of precision was to protect the truth, to protect the outcome from the distortions that happened when people rushed. She was an hour into the work when she heard Jasper's boots in the hall. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, stopping when he saw what she was doing. He did not speak. He pulled out a chair at the far end of the table and sat down, and she registered his presence the way she registered background sounds when she was working. Not as a distraction, but as a kind of ambient steadiness that made concentration easier. After a while, he said very quietly, "Tell me about your father." She kept her hands where they were. Talking, she had learned, did not always interrupt. Sometimes it was its own kind of attention. He was a physician, she said. A good one. He believed that medicine should be available to people who couldn't afford to pay for it, which did not make him popular with the people who ran the hospital he worked at. And he spent the last 10 years of his career trying to document something that no one wanted to believe was happening. That a compound found in a common plant could be used to mimic natural illness and produce specific outcomes. She paused, adjusting her focus. He presented his findings twice to professional bodies who had the authority to investigate. Both times he was dismissed. The second time he was publicly discredited. A colleague he had trusted gave testimony against him. After that, the hospital let him go, and he spent the last 2 years of his life in a small practice treating people who had no one else, writing letters to institutions that did not respond, and teaching me everything he knew because I was the only one left who was listening. The lamp made its small sound. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did out here, moving through the grass with that low, constant breathing. He was right, she said. He was right about all of it. And he died before he could prove it. She completed what she was doing and sat back. She looked at the result for a long time. But he taught me how to prove it. He just didn't know when he was teaching me that that's what he was doing. She looked up at Jasper. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful distance, not the controlled grief, not the deliberately managed steadiness. Something more open than any of those things. Something that had come up through all the layers while she was not watching. What does it show? He said. He meant the result. It matches, she said. What's in this vial matches what's on that receipt. The same compound. Which means Cutter's analysis holds. Which means Owen was right about what he found in the Aldermac water source. She looked up at him. Her voice was steady. Which means we have what we need. Jasper looked at the table, at Owen's papers, at the receipt, at her father's instruments laid out in their worn velvet. At the result she had produced from the vial Owen had taken from a dead man's land and hidden in the rock where they used to play as boys, waiting for someone to find it. He trusted that I would come here, Jasper said. Not quite to her, not quite to himself. He knew I would never leave the ranch. He knew I would eventually go back to the fence. A long pause. And he trusted that whoever he had written to in the East, whoever was coming, would be someone who could do what you just did. She looked at him. He couldn't have known that. He chose you, Jasper said simply. He wrote to 6 women. I found the correspondence record after he died. He wrote to 6 women over the course of a year before he settled on you. The others were perfectly suitable, but something in your letters made him write back to only you. He met her eyes across the lamp. He was careful about everything he did. He didn't choose things carelessly. She thought about a man she had never met, sitting in this kitchen, reading her letters, written with the particular carefulness of someone who was not used to being chosen for anything, and was determined to be honest rather than appealing, because honesty was the only currency she trusted. She thought about him deciding, on the basis of those letters, that she was worth sending for. She closed her father's instrument case gently. She sat with her hand on the lid for a moment, the way she always did, and then she looked at the lamp and the night beyond the window. There's something I have to tell you, she said, about why I was willing to come this far for someone I had never met. She paused. She did not often say this. She had not said it to anyone since her father died. The hospital I worked at, I helped a patient leave. A man who had been committed against his will, who was not ill in the way they said he was, who was being held because it was convenient for certain people that he be held. She kept her voice level. When I helped him, I lost my position, my reference, my reputation in that city. The engagement I had ended, the man I was intended to marry, came from a family with a stake in the facility. She looked at the table. I was not sorry I did it. I am still not sorry. But I had nothing left afterward. No position, no family, no one who would speak for me. She looked up. Owen's letter found me at the exact moment when the only direction I had left was forward. I came here because I had run out of other choices, and I am not ashamed of that. But I also came because something in his letter sounded like someone who understood what it meant to do the right thing and pay for it. Jasper had not moved. He was very still, the way he went still when something required his full attention. He would have understood that, he said finally. A pause. He spent 3 years watching men he knew die, gathering evidence alone, telling no one because telling someone put them at risk. He understood what it cost to do the right thing quietly. He looked at the table. I used to think he was too careful, too patient. I used to think if he had just pushed harder, moved faster. He stopped. But that wasn't who he was. He moved at the speed he could trust. She looked at him. At the jaw that had been set for days finally loosened by the specific gravity of speaking things out loud in a room with someone who would not look away from them. "We have to move carefully, too," she said. "Merritt knows we've been active. Crane knows I have medical training. Reuben is no longer reporting to them, but they'll notice the silence." She paused. "We have a narrow window." "I know." He looked at the papers on the table, at what Owen had built and she had extended. "What do you need?" She thought about it, about the precise shape of what was necessary and what was possible, and where those two things overlapped. About a woman whose father had been right about everything and had not lived to prove it, and a man whose brother had built the proof and not lived to deliver it, sitting across a kitchen table from each other in the late dark with all the pieces finally in one place. "I need 2 days," she said, "and I need you to trust me with the plan for the first one." He held her gaze across the lamp. The light between them was steady and small. Outside, the high country wind moved through the dry grass with its low, persistent sound. The sound Owen had described in his very first letter, the sound like breathing, the sound of something alive that could not be named. "All right," Jasper said. 2 days. She nodded. She began to put the papers back in the tin box, carefully, in the order Owen had arranged them. She knew what she had, and she knew what it meant. And she knew, with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything her hands were trained to do, that it would be enough. She pressed the lid of the tin box closed and held her palm flat against it for a moment. It held. The first day of those two was Wren's. She spent it in town, moving carefully and with purpose, the tin box locked in the chest under the bed, and the folded cloth still pressed inside her coat. She went to the general store for flour and coffee she did not particularly need, because a woman's shopping was unremarkable, and unremarkable was exactly what she needed to be. She talked to Mrs. Aldgate at the boarding house, who talked to everyone and retained everything. And she asked questions that did not sound like questions, the kind that arrived dressed as conversation and left carrying information. By mid-afternoon, she had confirmed 2 things. The first was that Cade Merritt had sent a rider out of Greystone the day before, heading east toward the regional land office. The second was that Dr. Crane had asked around town that morning whether anyone had seen Wren go anywhere near the apothecary building at the edge of town. They knew she had been to see Cutter. They were moving. She walked back to the ranch at a pace that did not betray what she was carrying, and she found Jasper in the barn with Reuben. And she told them both what she had learned in the same plain language she used for everything. Then she told them what needed to happen on the second day and what she needed each of them to do. Reuben nodded once. He understood his part. He studied her face in the barn light. "If this goes wrong, then we lose," she said. But Owen didn't gather all of that to have it sit in a rock until the property changed hands and someone threw it away. She held his gaze. "He built it for someone to use. We use it." The second morning came in gray and cold, the sky low and closed, the kind of sky that made the land below it feel smaller and more fragile than usual. Reuben rode out before dawn, carrying 2 things: a letter addressed to the families of the 4 dead men, and a copy of Owen's record that Wren had made by hand the night before, writing until the lamp burned low, her handwriting steady because she had decided it would be steady, and that was that. Reuben knew where each family lived. He had worked this land long enough to know every homestead within a day's ride, and he had a reason now to do something right. Wren stayed at the ranch and waited. Jasper stayed with her, which she had not asked him to do and which she did not mention. He worked through the morning, mending a hinge on the barn door, checking the stock, the ordinary work of the place. And she worked in the kitchen, and neither of them spoke much. And the silence between them was not the uneasy kind. It was the kind that belongs to people who have said what needed saying, and are now in the part that comes after words. At 10 o'clock, Cade Merritt arrived. He came faster than the previous visits, and with a different quality to his approach. He did not dismount at the gate and walk in with his performed ease. He rode straight to the front of the house and called out before he was off his horse, and his voice had lost its pleasant temperature. It was the voice of a man who had learned something he did not like and had not yet decided how to handle it. "Calder," he said. He used the wrong name, Jasper's given name, not his family name, the way one addresses a man one has decided to stop pretending to respect. "I need to speak with you. Now." Jasper came out of the barn unhurried. He walked to where Merritt sat on his horse and looked up at him without any of the careful blankness he had used in their previous conversations. Something had shifted in him since the tin box. Something had settled. "Get down off that horse," Jasper said. Not a request. Merritt got down. He was still controlled, still formidable, but there was something tight around his eyes that had not been there before. "I've had reports," he said. "Reports about what's been going on here, about questions being asked in town, about visits to certain individuals. I want to know what you think you're doing." "I think I'm finishing something my brother started," Jasper said. "Your brother was a—" Merritt caught himself. He recalibrated. He was, she could see from the kitchen window, a man who had stayed ahead of consequences for a long time by never fully losing his composure. He was working hard to keep it now. "Your brother had ideas about certain things that were unfounded. That were the product of a man whose health was failing and whose judgment had become unreliable. He kept good records for an unreliable man." Merritt's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think you have, but I want to be very clear with you about what happens to people who make accusations they can't back up in a territory like this. I want to be very clear about the position you're in, Jasper. You have a debt. You have a ranch that's been operating below capacity for 2 years. You have a woman living in your house whose legal standing here is ambiguous at best. You have nothing that any authority with the power to act on it would take seriously." She had heard enough. She came out of the house. Merritt turned and looked at her. He looked at her the way men look at a thing that has stepped outside the boundary they assigned to it. She walked to where Jasper was standing and stopped beside him. She reached into her coat and took out the folded cloth and held it so Merritt could see it without being close enough to touch it. "I've confirmed the compound," she said. "What's in Owen's sample matches the purchase record, which means we have a supply chain and a result." She looked at him steadily. "My father documented this compound for 10 years. He was dismissed and discredited, and the man who led that discrediting campaign was a colleague who later went on to work for a land development concern in the Eastern Territories." She paused. "I wonder if that concerns you at all." Merritt looked at the cloth. He looked at her face, and for the first time since she had arrived in Greystone, she watched his expression do something she had not seen it do before. It did not lose its control exactly. It lost its certainty, The particular certainty of a man who has always been able to see 3 moves ahead and has just encountered a board that is not arranged the way he expected. "Whatever you think that proves," he started. "It doesn't need to prove anything by itself," she said. "It needs to be part of a pattern." And it is part of a pattern. 6 men, 6 properties, 18 months of land transfers, a physician who signed every death certificate. She folded the cloth and put it back in her coat. "We sent word to the families of 4 of those men this morning. They'll be in Greystone by this afternoon." Something shifted behind Merritt's eyes. She watched it happen. The rapid calculation, the recognition that the ground had moved while he was looking at something else. He turned back to Jasper. "Whatever she's told you, whatever story she's constructed, you need to think very carefully about what you're doing here. I have resources you don't have. I have influence in places you don't have access to. If you push this, you will lose." Jasper let the silence sit between them for a long moment, long enough that Merritt's jaw shifted. Then, "Owen knew he was dying when he put all of that in the ground out by the fence. He knew he wasn't going to be able to finish it himself." His voice was quiet and entirely without anger, which made it considerably more difficult to argue with than anger would have been. "He left it for me to find because he knew I'd come back to that fence eventually. He knew I couldn't stay away from something I promised to fix." He looked at Merritt. "I'm going to fix it." Merritt stood there for a moment, a man recalculating, reassessing, determining whether there was still a move available to him. She could see him doing it. She watched the moment when he decided there was not. He got back on his horse. He did not say anything more. He rode away, and this time his pace was not the unhurried pace of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. This time he rode with the tight, urgent pace of a man who needed to be somewhere else before something caught up to him. Jasper watched him go until the road was empty and the dust had settled and the only sounds were the ordinary sounds of the land. Wind through grass, a horse in the barn, a bird doing something unremarkable in the eaves. Then he looked at Wren. "Do you think he'll run?" "Yes," she said, "but that's all right. The families will be here. Reuben will have reached them by now. And Merritt running is itself a kind of evidence. It tells its own story to anyone paying attention." They stood in the yard for a moment longer. The sky above them was the gray, closed kind, the kind that withheld rather than threatened, and the light it cast was flat and even and honest, the way light is honest when there are no shadows to hide in. Jasper looked at the north fence from where they stood. She looked at it too. It was still down, still patient in its ruin, still the thing it had been since before either of them arrived at this particular moment in each other's lives. But it looked different to her now than it had on the first night she had seen it in the moonlight from the wagon. It looked like something that could be fixed. It looked like something that was going to be fixed. "He built all of that," Jasper said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fence, and, she understood, at something beyond the fence that she could not quite see from where she was standing. Knowing he wasn't going to be able to finish it himself. Knowing that someone would have to come along after him and pick it up. His voice was even. She had learned by now that evenness from Jasper Holt was not the same as absence. It was the shape that presence took in him when presence was very great. He spent his last months building something for other people to use, and the whole time he was writing letters to a woman in the east about morning light. She did not say anything for a moment. She let it sit in the air between them, the way things needed to sit sometimes before they could be properly understood. He wanted both things to be true at once, she said finally. The work and the life. He didn't want to choose. Jasper was quiet. Then, he didn't have to. He just had to trust that somebody else would finish each of them. He finally looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen in 2 weeks of looking. Something that was not grief and not relief, and was not quite hope yet, but was in that neighborhood, moving in that direction. He trusted me with one, Jasper said, and he trusted you with the other. She thought about that. She thought about Owen Holt, sitting in this kitchen reading her letters and making a decision that was larger than either of them had understood when it was made. She thought about the precision of it. Not lucky, not accidental, but the product of a careful man who moved at the speed he could trust. Then we should probably both do our jobs, she said. Crane came an hour later. He came alone and on foot, which surprised her. It was a long walk from town, and not the entrance of a man who had options. He came to the back door rather than the front, which told her something too. He knocked, and Jasper opened the door, and Crane stood there with his hat in his hands, and the careful composure of a man who has been wearing a mask for so long that he has forgotten there is a face behind it and is now trying to remember what that face looks like. He was not what she expected, up close, without the architecture of his professional performance around him. He was just a man in his 60s with ink-stained hands and the eyes of someone who had been living a long time with something he could not quite put down. He looked at Wren. "Your father was Eli Calloway," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I was in his cohort, at the institution where he trained." He was still looking at her. "He was the best physician I ever knew, the most rigorous, the most honest." A pause. "I testified against his findings at the second inquiry. I said his methods were flawed, and his conclusions were the product of obsession rather than evidence." He stopped. "They were not flawed. His conclusions were correct. I knew that when I testified." The kitchen was very still. "Why are you here?" Jasper said from the doorway. Crane looked at him, then back at Wren. "Because Merritt just rode through town at a pace that told me he is not coming back. And because I am 63 years old, and I have signed my name to 6 documents that I knew were not true. And I would like, before whatever comes next, I would like to sign my name to something that is." He looked at the table, at the tin box sitting in the center of it. "I will make a full statement. I will give you everything I know. The supply records, the arrangements, the instructions I was given about what to look for and what to record and what to not record." He sat down in the nearest chair, not because he was invited to, but because his legs had apparently decided they were done holding him up. "I am not asking for anything in return. I am simply very tired of carrying this." Wren studied the table in front of her for a moment. The tin box, the papers, the worn velvet case. And then she looked at Crane, at the man who had helped destroy her father's reputation and had apparently been living inside that fact for longer than she had been alive. She thought about what her father would have said. She thought about what she herself wanted to say. And then she thought about what was actually useful. And she chose useful. "Then we'll need paper," she said, "and we'll need you to start at the beginning." The families came that afternoon, 4 of them, the Aldermach widow, a man named Garrett who had been the brother of the second to die, two others whose names Wren had only known from Owen's record and who were now standing in the yard looking at the ranch and the fence and the landscape their relatives had loved and then left without choosing to leave it. Jasper spoke to each of them. She stood nearby and listened and let him lead, because this was his part of the work and he knew how to do it. She watched him with people he knew, watched the careful, reserved man she had been learning across 2 weeks become something slightly different. Not warmer exactly, but more present, more willing to be in the room with what was painful. She watched him hold the Aldermach widow's gaze when she cried, not looking away, not offering meaningless comfort, just being there as a person who also understood loss and did not pretend otherwise. She watched him shake Garrett's hand and hold it a moment longer than necessary, the way men sometimes hold things that need holding. She thought, Owen was right about him. Owen had been right about both of them, which was the most remarkable thing, because he had made those judgments from the other side of distance and from the particular angle of a man who knew he was running out of time and had therefore become very precise about where he chose to place his trust. At one point, while Jasper was speaking with Garrett, the Aldermach widow came to stand beside Wren. She was a woman perhaps 50, with the particular self-possession of someone who had been managing things alone for long enough that managing things had simply become the texture of her days. She looked at Wren with eyes that had been taking in information quietly for a long time. "You didn't know Owen," she said. It was not an accusation. "No," Wren said. "I only knew his letters." The woman considered this. "He was the kind of man who wrote the same as he spoke," she said. "What he put on paper was what he meant. Not everyone is like that." She looked at Jasper across the yard. "Neither is his brother. But in the same way, what you see is what's there. The rest is just walls he built before he knew he'd need doors." She turned back to Wren. "He'll take them down eventually. That kind always does, when they find the right reason." She went back to join the others before Wren could decide whether to answer. When the last of the families had gone, taking copies of everything, with Crane's statement folded among Owen's papers, the yard was quiet again. The sky had opened while they were talking, and the light had come back, thin and clean, the kind of late afternoon light that made the land look like it was just being seen for the first time. Reuben came back from his circuit of the homesteads as the sun was dropping toward the ridge. He looked tired and something else. Lighter, she thought, in the way that people sometimes look lighter after they have put something down that they have been carrying at an angle for a long time. He unsaddled his horse and put it away in the barn, and then he came and stood in the yard and looked at Jasper and said, "It's done. Everyone you needed reached." Jasper nodded. "Thank you." Reuben looked at the ground. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "About Merritt. About the money." "You told me when it mattered," Jasper said. "That's what counts." She watched Reuben's face at that, watched him receive it, watched the thing it did to the set of his shoulders. She thought about how little it cost to say and how much it gave. After Reuben went inside, Jasper stood in the yard alone for a while. She left him there. She understood that some things needed to be finished in private, that a man who had spent 3 months telling himself his brother's death was only what it appeared to be needed a moment to stand with the knowledge that it was not, and what it was instead, and what that meant for the 3 months he had spent carrying the wrong version of the truth. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window and watched him without watching, The way she watched things, she was not certain she had the right to see. He stood at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hands and his face turned toward the north, toward where the fence was. And she thought he was probably not seeing the fence at all, but the thing that existed in the same direction as the fence, which was Owen, which was what Owen had done, and what Owen had known, and what Owen had trusted him to understand eventually. He stood there for a long time. The light changed around him, going from the thin, clean quality of late afternoon to the warmer, lower quality of early evening, and he did not move. She was not worried. She had learned across 2 weeks the difference between Jasper Holt standing still because he was refusing to feel something, and Jasper Holt standing still because he was feeling it fully and had decided to let it take whatever space it needed. This was the second kind. This was the kind that a person came back from in better condition than they left. When he came inside, the kitchen was warm. She had put something on the stove. The same beans and salt pork that had been in the pot the first night she arrived, because it was what she knew how to make quickly, and because some things, she had learned, were best marked by the ordinary rather than the ceremonial. He came in and stopped in the doorway, the way he had stopped on the first morning when he found the table set and the biscuits steaming. He looked at her the same way. She looked back at him. He would have liked this, Jasper said. He did not say whose name he meant. He did not need to. Yes, she said, he would have. They ate. The stove kept its small warmth. Outside, the dark came in over the ridge, and somewhere in the territory, the roads were carrying consequences in various directions. Toward families who now had answers. Toward a land office that would find certain transfers suddenly contested. Toward a man on a horse riding away from something he had thought was permanent and was discovering was not. But inside the kitchen, for this particular hour, it was quiet. And it was enough. The morning after was very quiet. Not the quiet of held breath or waiting. The other kind, the kind that comes when something that has been pressing against a place for a long time finally lifts, and the place settles back into its own shape, and the air is simply air again. Wren stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the light come in over the ridge. She had watched it every morning since she arrived, but this morning it looked different. Not because it was different, because she was. She thought about the first morning she had stood at this window, those early days after arriving, after learning what she had learned from Jasper at the breakfast table, after the first restless night of turning things over in the dark. She had stood at this window then with her coffee and looked out at the land and tried to understand what she had arrived inside of. The land had not given her an answer. Land rarely did, but it had given her something steadier than an answer, which was the sense of a scale that did not change with the day's events. The ridge was the same ridge at the beginning of all of this, as it was now at what felt, tentatively, like a different kind of beginning. That constancy was not comfort exactly, but it was orientation, and orientation was something she had not had in a very long time before she arrived here. She thought about Owen's papers, which were now with the families who needed them, and Crane's statement, which was on its way to an authority with the power to act on it, and the tin box itself, which was sitting on Owen's desk in Owen's office, empty now of everything it had been entrusted to hold. It had done its job. It had waited in the dark in the rock, and it had held what needed holding, and now it was empty. And that was a kind of completion she had not expected to feel as clearly as she did. The morning had come in full over the ridge. the slow, unhurried way Owen had described it in his first letter. And the light came through the east window of the kitchen and fell across the table, and the 2 cups she had set out without thinking about it, the way she set out 2 cups now without thinking about it, because that was what the table required and this kitchen had become, in ways she was still in the process of understanding, her kitchen too. The families of the 4 men had gathered the previous afternoon in the church, the only building in Greystone large enough to hold them all, which was different from the events of the day before, which had happened at the ranch. This second gathering, in town, was for the community. Jasper had sent word, and they had come. Wren had stood at the front of that room with Owen's papers and Cutter's cloth, and the receipt, and Crane's statement, and she had explained what she knew in the plainest language she had. She had not asked them to believe her. She had shown them the evidence and described what it meant, and let them arrive at their own conclusions, because that was what her father had always said was the difference between someone who wanted to be right and someone who wanted to be useful. She had answered their questions steadily, without hedging, without softening what was hard. At the end, a woman named Bertrice Aldermach, widow of Edwin, the first man whose water source Owen had tested, had stood up from her pew and said, in a voice that did not shake, "My husband complained of the water for 2 months before he died. I told Crane. Crane said it was nothing. I believed him because he was the doctor, and I was just a wife." She had sat back down. "I want someone to explain to me why a wife's observation wasn't worth more than that." No one had answered her. The question was not the kind that had an answer, but it had settled over the room and remained there, and Wren had thought about her father, and about the particular silence that follows the naming of things that should have been named much sooner. Crane had given his statement freely to the assembled families. He had stood at the front of that church, looking like a man who had decided that whatever came next was easier to face than what he had already been living with. And he had said what he had done, and why he had done it, and where the records were, and how it could be verified. He said it like a man reading from a document he found deeply unpleasant but could not dispute. No drama, no performance. Just the shape of the thing, plainly spoken. Cade Merritt had not been there. Merritt had left Greystone before the church gathering, which surprised no one who understood how men like Merritt operated. They did not stay to face consequences. They moved to where consequences had not yet arrived. But the papers he had left behind, and the testimony that would follow, and the evidence assembled in the tin box that Owen Holt had sealed in the rock at the edge of his own property, would follow him in the manner that such things always eventually do. Reuben had ridden out at first light to carry word to the nearest settlement with the authority to receive it. He had ridden with the focused purpose of a man who understood that this was not absolution, but it was something, and something was what he had. The debt against the ranch had dissolved with Merritt's departure. There was no one left to collect it in the form it had been constructed. The north parcel remained exactly what it had always been, part of the Holt property, bounded by the broken fence that Owen and Jasper had promised each other they would fix. That afternoon, Wren heard the sound of hammering. She came out of the house and shaded her eyes and looked north, and what she saw was Jasper at the fence line, working. He had the posts and the rails and the tools, and he was moving with the steady, deliberate pace of a man who intended to finish what he was doing before the light went. She stood and watched him for a moment. Then she went to the barn and found a second hammer. She was not skilled at fencing. She had never built or repaired a fence in her life, but she was skilled at watching how something was done and then doing it. And Jasper showed her without being asked, held the post, set the angle, drove the rail into place, and she followed his lead, and they worked in the afternoon light without talking much, the sound of the hammering going out across the property and coming back as its own kind of echo. When the last post was set, Jasper stood back and looked at the fence running straight along the northern boundary, solid and plain and repaired. He was very still for a moment. She stood beside him and did not interrupt the stillness. He would say it took long enough, Jasper said finally. He would be right, she said. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she had seen once before, in a different context, and she had the same reaction to it, a kind of startled recognition, like hearing a sound she had been listening for without knowing it. They sat down in the grass beside the fence, because there was nowhere else to sit, and the grass was dry, and the afternoon had turned warm in the way that high country afternoons sometimes do, generously without warning. The sky was the particular shade of blue that existed only at this altitude, deep and clear and indifferent to the smallness of everything happening under it. She looked at the fence from where she sat, the posts she had helped set, the rails she had helped drive into place. She was not good at it. Her arms had ached within the first hour, and her hands would be sore tomorrow, and several of the rails she had struck were not quite as straight as Jasper's, but they were there. They were part of the fence. They would hold. She thought about what Cutter had said when she thanked him. Owen picked a good person to trust with this. She thought about what the Aldermac widow had said about Jasper. Walls he built before he knew he'd need doors. She thought about what Owen had written in his very first letter. I would like to build something here that lasts. And she thought about how he had not meant only the ranch, had probably never only meant the ranch, had meant something larger and harder to name that required two people of a certain kind to build properly. She did not say any of this out loud. Some things were more real for being kept quiet, at least at first, at least until they had settled into something solid enough to support the weight of words. What will you do? He said. He asked it looking straight ahead, which was how he asked most things that mattered. I don't know yet, she said, which was true. She had not let herself think past the last 2 weeks. She had been managing the present with both hands and had not had a free hand for the future. He was quiet for a moment. The families will want to talk to you again. There'll be questions and inquiries, and the whole account will need to be given formally when the time comes. He paused. That could take a while. I imagine it will, she said. The ranch will need... He stopped, started again with more care. I run this place alone. I have Reuben. But there are things that Owen used to do that I don't. Accounts, correspondence, the records. He looked at the fence. Things that require someone who can read what the numbers are actually saying. She looked at the side of his face, at the precise angle of his jaw, at the way he was constructing this sentence like a man building a fence, careful about the weight it needed to bear before he committed to the structure. You could ask me directly, she said. He turned and looked at her. This time, he did not look away. Would you stay? She held his gaze. She thought about the city she had left, the hospital that was gone, the room above the laundry that belonged to someone else, the life that had closed behind her like a door she had not known was going to close. She thought about 11 days on a stagecoach and a letter she had memorized, and a man who had never gotten to read her letters back, and a tin box in a rock that had been waiting for exactly the right person to come along and open it. She thought about what her father had said near the end, when the weight of everything he had tried to prove and failed to prove was most visible on him. He had said, "The work doesn't stop, Wren. It passes to whoever picks it up next. That's all legacy means. The work continuing in different hands." She pressed her palm flat against the dry grass. She looked at the fence they had just built together. She looked at Jasper Holt, who had been carrying this land and this grief and this unreturned debt to his brother for months, alone, in the particular silence of a man who believed that asking for help was a luxury he had not earned. "I'll stay," she said, "through the inquiries, through whatever comes next." And after that, she looked at him. Something passed between them. Not declaration, not promise, nothing as loud as either of those things. Something quieter. The acknowledgement of a door that was open and had been open for some time, and that neither of them was going to rush through, because rushing was not how either of them was built. After that, she said, "I'll still be here." He nodded. He looked back at the fence. After a moment, he said, "Owen would have liked you." "I think," she said, "I would have liked him too." The sun began its slow work toward the ridge. They did not move. The grass moved around them in the long, low voice of the wind, that sound that was always here, that Owen had described in his very first letter as something like breathing, something alive that could not be named. Wren had read that description in a cold room above a laundry on a morning that felt like a very long time ago, and had felt something shift inside her chest. She had not known then what it was. She understood it better now, sitting in the grass beside a man who had kept his promise to the dead and a fence that was finally standing straight. Later, when the light was nearly gone, she went inside and found her father's instrument case on the bedroom table where she had left it. She opened it and looked at the 6 instruments in their worn velvet. She did not reach for them. She did not need them this evening. She had used them for what they were made for, and they had done what they were supposed to do. And now they rested in their grooves, clean and ready, waiting for the next thing that required them. She closed the case gently. She put it on the shelf above the bed, not the floor, not the bottom of the bag, the shelf where things lived when they had found a place. She stepped back and looked at it, sitting there in the dimness, solid and particular, the last thing her father had given her, a piece of equipment and a form of faith. She heard Jasper in the kitchen, the sound of the stove, the smell of something plain and good beginning to fill the house. She stood a moment longer in the doorway of the room that had been Owen Holt's and was now simply the room where she slept, and she breathed the way she breathed when something difficult was over and the next thing had not yet begun. Fully, without hurry, all the way down. She thought about the instrument case on the shelf, about what it would mean to have a shelf for it, not the floor of a bag, not a surface she would clear when she packed again, but a shelf, a place that would be there in the morning and the morning after that. She had not had a shelf for anything in 4 years. Not since her father died and the small apartment above the practice was cleared out and everything went into bags, and she had told herself that traveling light was a skill and not a loss, and had almost believed it. She crossed the kitchen and opened the door. Then she went to help with supper. Jasper moved to one side of the stove without being asked, making room. She took the other side. They worked without discussing it. The way people work in kitchens when they have been in enough hard situations together that small coordination has stopped requiring conversation. The lamp was lit. The window showed the last pale line of light along the ridge. When they sat down, Jasper poured the coffee and set her cup in front of her. And she looked at it. And then she looked at him. And something in that ordinary moment, the cup, the coffee, the table between them, and everything it had held in the past 2 weeks, made her very still for a second. Not sad, not happy exactly. Something more durable than either of those things. He looked up and saw her looking. He did not ask. He simply held her gaze for a moment, and she saw in his face the same quality she imagined was in hers. The look of a person who has arrived somewhere unexpectedly and found, against all reasonable expectation, that it is exactly where they needed to be. Outside, the high country dark had settled in full, and the stars were coming in the way they always came out here. All at once, without apology, more than a person could count. The wind moved through the grass. The fence stood along the northern boundary, straight and repaired, doing what fences do, holding the shape of a thing against the pressure of everything that wanted to push it over. Wren picked up her coffee cup. She wrapped both hands around it. She felt the warmth of it, steady and real, moving through her palms. She did not think about tomorrow. Tomorrow would come in its own time, over the ridge, slow and unhurried, the way Owen had said it did. There would be more to do. There would always be more to do. But for this moment, in this kitchen, with the lamp burning and the coffee warm and the man across the table who had kept his promise to the dead, sitting in the particular quiet of someone who had finally, after a very long time, put something down. For this moment, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the precise and honest language she had always preferred, exactly what it was: a beginning.